The smell of turned earth, the endless Michigan sky pressing down on a boy's shoulders, the weight of generations who worked this same soil, their backs bent like wheat stalks in autumn wind. Young Henry Ford knew what awaited him, the same fate that claimed his father, that claimed every man in Dearborn Township. The farm would consume him. It would devour his youth, his strength, his dreams, leaving only weathered hands and an aching spine as testament to a life measured in harvests and hardship. But something else called to him, something that thundered past on distant roads, trailing steam and possibility, something that ticked and turned in the pocket watch his mother had given him, each gear a small miracle of purpose and precision. This is the story of how one boy's terror of stagnation became the engine of revolution. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Consider the mathematics of exhaustion. Henry's father, William Ford, rose before dawn and collapsed after dusk, 6 days each week following rhythms older than memory. The seasonal cycle demanded everything: ploughing in spring when soil turned from frost, planting when danger of freeze finally passed, cultivating through summer's heat, harvesting before autumn's first hard cold, preparing through winter for the whole relentless sequence to begin again. 160 acres of Michigan land, every acre requiring human muscle and animal strength, the mathematics never changing, never offering mercy. The boy watched his father age in increments. 35 years old, but moving like a man of 50. Hands calloused thick as leather harness. Shoulders permanently stooped from lifting, carrying, pulling against gravity and soil. This was prosperity by 1860s standards. The Fords owned their land, raised sufficient crops, maintained livestock, stood respected in the community. But Henry saw only the cost, the endless repetition, the way the farm swallowed everything and returned so little. Then came July 1863, and Mary Littogott Ford brought her first son into the world in the upstairs bedroom of their white farmhouse. She named him Henry, and from the beginning he belonged more to her than to the land. Where William saw acres requiring work, Mary saw a boy requiring wonder. She taught him to read by lamplight. She showed him how household devices functioned, the mechanics of clocks, the principles of pulleys, the beautiful logic hidden inside everyday objects. The pocket watch became his inheritance and his obsession. A simple timepiece, gold-plated brass, the kind merchants carried in waistcoat pockets. But to young Henry it contained infinity. Under the cover, behind the face with its Roman numerals, an entire universe of interaction and purpose existed, gears meshing in perfect synchronization, springs storing and releasing energy according to principles he didn't yet understand but felt instinctively. Each component designed for exactly one function, yet all functions combining to achieve something miraculous, the measurement and display of time itself. When Mary Ford died in March 1876, giving birth to her 8th child, 12-year-old Henry received that watch as his mother's final gift. The house became a tomb, the farm became a prison, and the boy who had lost the only person who understood him retreated into the mechanical world where everything made sense, where every effect had a cause, where death didn't steal mothers from children without reason or warning. He disassembled that watch 70 times. Not 71, not 69, exactly 70 complete disassemblies and reconstructions, spread across months of obsessive study. The first time, he nearly destroyed it, springs flying loose, tiny screws rolling across the floor, his hands shaking with fear that he'd ruined his mother's memory. By the 10th time, he could map each component's location and function. By the 30th, he understood the relationships between parts, how force transferred through the mechanism, how energy stored and released created the steady tick that marked seconds into minutes into hours. By the 70th time, he had mastered not just this watch but the principles underlying all watches, and by extension, all machines. Imagine being 12 years old and discovering that the physical world operates according to rules you can learn and master, that mechanical systems don't deceive or abandon you, that if you study something carefully enough, patiently enough, it reveals its secrets completely. For a boy drowning in grief and trapped on a farm he despised, this realization arrived like salvation. Word spread through Dearborn Township. The Ford boy could fix timepieces. Neighbors brought him their broken clocks and watches, these precious devices that regulated life before electricity, made time abundant and cheap. Henry repaired them for free, not for charity but for education. Each new mechanism taught him something. Each problem he solved increased his understanding of how humans captured natural forces and bent them toward purpose. But watches, however fascinating, remained small. They measured time but didn't challenge it. They marked hours but couldn't compress them. Henry wanted something larger, something that matched the scale of his ambition and the depth of his resentment toward the farm's endless manual labor. The steam engine that passed the Ford property on summer afternoons of 1876 provided that vision. A road engine, they called it, a self-propelled steam traction engine pulling threshing equipment between farms. The operator, seeing a thin 13-year-old boy staring with desperate hunger at his machine, made a decision that altered history. He stopped the engine, he let the boy climb aboard, and he let Henry fire the boiler, feel the heat radiating from that firebox. The flames consuming wood and coal, transforming solid matter into raw thermal energy. Steam building pressure inside the boiler, invisible force accumulating until it demanded release. Then the hiss and thrust as that pressure drove pistons, turned crankshafts, rotated wheels that moved tons of iron and steel across dirt roads without a single horse required. Power, mobility, freedom from biological limitation. Henry's hands trembled on the controls. The heat washed over his face like summer sun concentrated and intensified. The machine responded to his touch, obeyed his will, performed work that would have required dozens of men or horses. In that moment, standing on a steam engine thundering down a Michigan road, 13-year-old Henry Ford discovered his purpose with the same certainty that monks find God or artists find their calling. He would master machines, he would perfect them, he would make them serve humanity rather than slavery, and he would escape the farm that had killed his mother and was slowly killing his father. The next 3 years passed in mounting tension. William Ford expected his eldest son to embrace farming, to prepare for the inheritance of land and responsibility. Henry performed his duties with mechanical efficiency, but zero emotional investment. He milked cows while mentally redesigning the milking process. He plowed fields while imagining traction engines pulling multiple plows. He fixed farm equipment for neighbors, gaining reputation as the boy who understood machinery better than men twice his age. His younger brother enjoyed the farm. His sisters accepted its rhythms. But Henry existed in a state of contained desperation, like steam building in a boiler with no release valve. He read every technical manual he could find. He sketched engine designs in notebook margins. He calculated gear ratios and power outputs using mathematics. He taught himself because Dearborn's one-room schoolhouse couldn't provide the knowledge he craved. On his 16th birthday, the release valve opened. Henry Ford told his father he was leaving for Detroit, not to visit, to live, to work, to learn everything about the machines that would replace the brutal manual labor destroying men like William Ford across agricultural America. The argument that followed became family legend. William Ford, now 49 years old and looking 65, offered his son everything. The farm would be Henry's. 160 acres of paid land, ready to support a family, providing security that most Americans only dreamed about. Stay, work the soil, marry a local girl, raise children who would inherit what generations had built. Henry refused. The farm represented death to him. Slow death, grinding death, but death nonetheless. His mother had died there. His father was dying there incrementally, one harvest at a time. Henry would rather starve in Detroit than prosper in Dearborn if prosperity meant accepting the agricultural trap. He walked away with $7 in his pocket and his mother's watch in his vest, 16 years old. No formal engineering education, no job waiting in the city, no connections or prospects, just absolute certainty that his future involved machines, motion, and freedom from the farm's gravitational pull. Detroit, in 1879, contained perhaps 100,000 souls, most of them struggling in what remained a frontier city despite delusions of Eastern sophistication. Mud streets, wooden sidewalks, coal smoke from factories creating perpetual haze, horses everywhere, 10,000 horses producing tons of manure daily, the waste piling in streets until rain washed it toward the Detroit River in streams of contamination. Henry found work at the James Flower & Brothers machine shop for $2.50 per week. He paid $1 weekly for a boarding house room the size of a closet. He spent another $1 on food. The remaining 50 cents represented his entire wealth, his margin between survival and starvation. The machine shop manufactured everything Detroit's growing industry required: brass valves, iron gears, steel shafts, components for steamships and factories and railway equipment. Henry worked 9 hours daily, 6 days weekly, learning to operate lathes, milling machines, drill presses. He learned to read technical drawings, to measure tolerances in thousandths of an inch, to understand how imprecision in one component multiplied through an entire mechanical system. At night, in his tiny room by candlelight, he sketched improvements to the designs he'd seen that day. He filled notebooks with calculations and drawings, teaching himself mechanical engineering through observation and thought experiments. While other young men spent evenings in saloons, Henry studied. While others pursued girls, Henry pursued knowledge. Not from virtue, but from single-minded obsession, the shop foreman noticed. He was a boy who arrived early and stayed late, who volunteered for complex jobs other machinists avoided, who asked endless questions not from ignorance but from determination to understand principles underlying techniques. Within months, despite his youth, Henry became the foreman's solution to difficult problems. But $2.50 per week, even for someone as frugal as Henry, meant poverty. After 6 months, he found additional work at a jewelry shop, repairing watches and clocks in the evenings. The jeweler, impressed by Henry's skill with delicate mechanisms, offered him an apprenticeship, a path toward respectable middle-class prosperity as a watchmaker. Henry refused. Watches remained too small. They didn't move, didn't transport, didn't multiply human power. They merely marked time while life passed. He wanted engines. The Detroit Dry Dock Company hired him at $5 weekly, a fortune compared to his previous wages. The dry dock built and repaired steamships for Great Lakes commerce, and here Henry encountered engines on a scale that made road engines seem like toys. Massive steam plants producing hundreds of horsepower, propeller shafts thick as tree trunks, boilers large enough to walk inside, generating steam at pressures that could tear metal if improperly managed. He learned marine engineering. He learned how ships converted fuel to motion. He learned that all engines, regardless of size or specific design, operated on identical principles: capture energy, concentrate it, release it in controlled bursts that could be harnessed for work. The details varied, but the fundamentals remained constant. And he learned about a new type of engine emerging from European inventors, an internal combustion engine. Instead of burning fuel outside a boiler to create steam that pushed pistons, This engine burned fuel inside cylinders, using explosions to drive pistons directly. The principle meant engines could be far smaller and lighter than steam plants while producing equivalent power. Think about what that meant to someone like Henry Ford. Steam engines required boilers, water tanks, fuel storage, condensers, hundreds or thousands of pounds of equipment to produce reliable power. An internal combustion engine burning gasoline or kerosene could theoretically provide the same power in a package weighing mere dozens of pounds. You could mount such an engine on a wheeled frame. You could create a vehicle that moved under its own power without rails or horses. You could build a horseless carriage. The idea obsessed Henry through the late 1880s. By now he'd returned to Dearborn, not to farm but to live cheaply while working for Westinghouse, servicing their portable steam engines across southern Michigan. His father, seeing Henry's continuing refusal to embrace agriculture, had given up on converting him, and instead offered 40 acres of timber if Henry would at least stay near home. Henry accepted, not for the timber, but because it provided income while he studied the new engine technology, and because he'd met Clara Bryant, a farmer's daughter who somehow saw past his mechanical obsession to the man underneath. They married in April 1888, and Clara became the only person besides his mother who believed Henry might actually achieve his impossible dreams. In their small Dearborn home, while Clara ran the household and Henry sold timber during the day, he spent every evening building what would become his first engine. Not a watch, not a clock, an actual internal combustion engine that would burn fuel and produce power. He had no formal training in this technology, no engineering degree, no mentor teaching him the principles. He had only technical articles in magazines, descriptions of European engines, his own mechanical intuition developed through 15 years of obsessive study and determination that approached madness. The first engine failed, the second failed, the third failed. He built them from scrap metal and parts he machined himself, each failure teaching him something about compression ratios, ignition timing, fuel mixture. Clara watched her husband disappear into his workshop night after night, returning near midnight covered in grease, reeking of gasoline, exhausted but somehow energized by problems that would have defeated anyone less stubborn. But Dearborn, even with Clara's support, felt like retreat. Detroit was where the future was being built. Detroit had electricity, ESSA, the new power source that would transform everything. And Detroit's Edison Illuminating Company was hiring engineers to operate their generating station. In September 1891, Henry and Clara moved to Detroit for the final time. Henry took a position with Edison Illuminating at $40 monthly. Dees rented, more money than he'd ever earned. Reliable money, respectable money. They rented a house on Bagley Avenue, and Henry settled into the routine of an electrical engineer, managing the equipment that provided Detroit with the miracle of electric light. But every moment away from Edison Illuminating, he worked on his true passion. In a brick shed behind the Bagley Avenue house, Henry Ford prepared to succeed where he'd previously failed. He would build an engine that worked. He would mount it on a frame with wheels, and he would create a vehicle that moved under its own power, controlled by human intention, free from horses and their limitations. Clara Ford, patient and faithful, supported her husband's obsession while he spent their limited income on metal and machines. She believed in him when no one else did. When he failed, she encouraged him to try again. When he doubted, she reminded him of his purpose. And on Christmas Eve, 1893, her faith would be justified in the most dramatic way possible. The boy who feared the farm had become the man who would revolutionize how humanity moved across the earth. But first, he had to make an engine explode in his kitchen while his wife dripped gasoline into the carburetor, and neighbors wondered what madness possessed the Ford household on the night Christians celebrated a carpenter's birth. That explosion would change everything. Picture Clara Ford's kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1893. A modest room in a rented house on Bagley Avenue, decorated for the holiday with pine branches and candles, the scent of dinner still lingering in the air, and clamped to her kitchen sink, vibrating against porcelain, a crude metal contraption that her husband insists will change the world. Henry had been building engines for years, each one a lesson in failure. Too heavy, insufficient compression, poor fuel mixture, ignition timing wrong. The mathematics of internal combustion seemed simple on paper. Compress a fuel-air mixture, ignite it, capture the explosive force to drive a piston. But translating theory into functioning metal required solving hundreds of interconnected problems simultaneously. This engine, his latest attempt, weighed just 50 pounds, 2 cylinders arranged horizontally, a flywheel to smooth the power pulses, a carburetor he'd designed himself to mix gasoline vapor with air in precisely the right ratio, an ignition system using electric spark from a battery, every component machined by hand in his workshop, fitted together through trial and error and mechanical intuition. But an engine clamped to a workbench remained theoretical. It needed fuel. It needed someone to operate the controls while Henry managed the ignition. It needed Clara. She understood what her husband was attempting, even if Detroit society thought him mad. While other men spent Christmas Eve with family and church services, Henry Ford crouched beside a gasoline engine in his kitchen, asking his wife to help him create controlled explosions. Clara could have refused, could have demanded normalcy, could have insisted that Christmas Eve deserved celebration rather than mechanical experiments. Instead, she picked up the gasoline can. She positioned herself at the carburetor intake. She prepared to drip fuel into the mechanism while Henry turned the flywheel and managed the electrical contacts that would generate spark at precisely the right moment. Consider what they were attempting. Gasoline, a volatile petroleum distillate that most people in 1893 barely understood. Explosive force contained within metal cylinders machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Timing so critical that a fraction of a second's difference between fuel injection and ignition meant the difference between power and failure. Henry nodded to Clara. She began dripping gasoline into the carburetor intake, the clear liquid vaporizing as it mixed with air. Henry spun the flywheel, building momentum, his other hand on the ignition switch. Once, twice, 3 times. The engine turning over without firing, just the mechanical sound of metal sliding against metal. Then, the 4th revolution. The explosion shook the kitchen. Not a gentle hum or smooth purr, but a violent detonation that rattled dishes in cupboards and sent vibrations through the floorboards. The engine fired, caught, fired again. The cylinders hammered in sequence, a bang, 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 each explosion driving a piston, turning the crankshaft, spinning the flywheel that now maintained its own momentum. Smoke filled the room, the acrid smell of burning gasoline mixing with exhaust fumes. The noise was tremendous, like rapid gunfire echoing in the enclosed space. But the engine ran. For 30 seconds it ran under its own power, consuming gasoline and air and producing mechanical motion, before Henry shut it down to prevent Clara's kitchen from filling completely with smoke. They stood in the haze, looking at each other across the clamped engine, both understanding what they'd just witnessed. The principle worked. Internal combustion could be controlled. An engine small enough to carry could produce power sufficient to move a vehicle. Henry Ford, 30 years old, employed as an electrical engineer, had just proven to himself and his wife that the horseless carriage was possible. Not someday, not in theory, now. With the right refinements, the right design, the right manufacturing, he could build a vehicle that moved under its own power. Neighbors complained about the noise and smoke from the Ford household at Christmas Eve. The landlord questioned what mechanical experiments were being conducted in a residential building. Clara spent the next day airing out the kitchen and washing dishes that smelled of exhaust. But Henry had crossed a threshold. The question was no longer whether an internal combustion engine could work. The question was how to make it work reliably, efficiently, powerfully enough to move a carriage carrying passengers across real roads. His position at Edison Illuminating Company provided the resources for this pursuit. $40 monthly had risen to $75, then to $100 as Henry proved himself invaluable at managing the electrical generating equipment. The Edison station operated continuously, providing power to Detroit's growing electric lighting network, and someone needed to be available at all hours to handle emergencies and maintain equipment. Henry volunteered for night shifts. While Clara slept, he worked at Edison, illuminating from 6 in the evening until 6 in the morning, earning his salary by keeping Detroit's lights burning. But the night shift meant access to the station's complete machine shop, lathes, drill presses, milling machines, welding equipment, all the tools required to build an engine properly, rather than cobbling one together from scrap. Between his rounds, checking generators and boilers, Henry machined engine parts. He cut precise cylinders from cast iron blocks. He turned crankshafts on the lathe, balancing them to minimize vibration. He fabricated pistons, connecting rods, valves, every component needed for a complete engine. The Edison Illuminating Shop became his secret laboratory. His salary bought time and materials, and his engineering skills improved with each piece he manufactured. He built his second engine in 1894, then his third, his fourth, each one teaching him something new about compression ratios, about ignition timing, about the relationship between cylinder bore and piston stroke that determined an engine's power and efficiency. He destroyed more engines than he saved, discarding designs that showed fundamental flaws, keeping only those that demonstrated improvement. By 1895, he'd built and tested 15 distinct engine designs. By 1896, 28 complete engines had run in the Edison Illuminating Shop during night shifts while Detroit slept, and Henry Ford pursued his obsession in 10 stolen hours between his official duties. The mathematics of power-to-weight ratio consumed him. A horse weighed roughly 1,000 pounds and produced about 1 horsepower, the ability to move 550 pounds 1 foot per second, or 33,000 foot-pounds of work per minute. An engine that could match a horse's power while weighing only 100 pounds would revolutionize transportation. An engine that produced 2 horsepower at 150 pounds would enable vehicles that outperformed horses while costing less to operate. Henry's 29th engine, completed in spring 1896, achieved that ratio. 2 cylinders, 4-stroke cycle, water-cooled, producing approximately 4 horsepower, while weighing 200 pounds, including flywheel and all accessories. Not as efficient as he'd hoped, but sufficient. Sufficient to power a carriage. Sufficient to prove his concept in the real world rather than a workshop. He built a frame, 4 bicycle wheels mounted on a simple rectangular chassis made from steel tubing, a seat for the driver, a tiller for steering. Henry rejected the wagon-style steering wheel as too cumbersome, choosing instead a vertical handle connected directly to the front axle. A 2-speed transmission he designed himself, giving the vehicle a low gear for starting and hills and a high gear for level roads. And mounted in the center, his engine, his 200 pounds of mechanical achievement, connecting to the rear wheels through a chain drive. The vehicle was ugly, primitive. It looked like a motorized wagon designed by someone with no concern for aesthetics. The frame was exposed metal. The engine sat naked, all its components visible. The whole contraption measured just 5 feet wide and 6 feet long, barely large enough for 2 people sitting in tandem. But it worked. In his workshop behind the house on Bagley Avenue, Henry test-fired the engine with it mounted on the vehicle frame. The chain drive transmitted power to the rear wheels. The steering responded to the tiller. Every system functioned as designed. He had built a horseless carriage, He had created a self-propelled vehicle that required no animal, no rails, no external power source. Only one problem remained. The vehicle was too wide for the workshop door. Henry Ford, having spent months building this contraption in a workshop, had never measured the door opening. The vehicle couldn't exit. He would have to disassemble it, move it outside in pieces, and reassemble it, losing days of testing time and risking damage to carefully calibrated components. Instead, at 2 o'clock in the morning on June 4th, 1896, Henry picked up an axe and demolished the brick wall of his workshop. The crash of breaking bricks and splintering wood woke Clara and several neighbors. Henry didn't care. He'd been working toward this moment for years. A brick wall wouldn't stop him now. With the wall opened, Henry rolled his vehicle into the alley behind Bagley Avenue. Rain was falling. A light summer rain that turned Detroit's unpaved streets to mud. He climbed onto the seat. He advanced the spark and throttle. He released the brake, and he pressed the ignition button. The engine fired. The vehicle lurched forward, and Henry Ford drove through Detroit in the early morning darkness, the first person to operate a gasoline-powered automobile through the streets of a city that would become the automotive capital of the world. The vehicle was loud. Neighbors later complained about the noise that woke them. It was smoky, the exhaust visible even in darkness. It was unreliable. Henry had to stop twice to adjust the ignition and once to tighten a chain. But it moved under its own power at approximately 20 miles per hour, faster than a horse could trot, controlled entirely by the driver without any animal intelligence required. He drove for 3 hours that night, testing the vehicle on different streets, learning how it handled, identifying weaknesses that needed correction. The steering was too sensitive. The transmission needed better synchronization. The ignition timing varied with engine speed, requiring constant adjustment. But these were refinements. The fundamental principle was proven. A gasoline-powered automobile was practical. Yet Henry Ford's achievement remained invisible to most of Detroit. A few people saw him driving his strange vehicle in the early morning hours and thought him either brilliant or insane. The newspapers didn't cover it. Why would they report on one man's mechanical hobby when hundreds of inventors worldwide were experimenting with various forms of horseless carriages? Henry understood that building one vehicle proved nothing. Manufacturing vehicles profitably, making them reliable enough for daily use, pricing them affordably, these challenges dwarfed the merely technical problems he'd already solved. He needed capital. He needed investors. He needed to transform his workshop prototype into a business. The Detroit Automobile Company, formed in 1899 with Henry as chief engineer and superintendent. Wealthy Detroit businessmen provided capital, certain that the horseless carriage represented the future of transportation. They'd seen Henry's vehicle. They understood that if automobiles could be manufactured efficiently, the market was virtually unlimited. But Henry's first commercial vehicle, heavier and more refined than his original, cost too much and performed too poorly. The investors had expected production of multiple vehicles per month. Instead, Henry insisted on perfecting the design, building only a handful of automobiles that sold for prices only wealthy buyers could afford. After 18 months, the company had produced fewer than 20 vehicles and hemorrhaged money. The investors shut it down. Henry's second attempt, the Henry Ford Company, began in 1901 with new investors and similar expectations. Again, Henry focused on engineering perfection rather than production efficiency. Again, investors grew impatient with slow output and mounting costs. Again, the company failed, this time with Henry forced out by investors who brought in other engineers to salvage their capital. 2 failed companies, thousands of investor dollars lost, a reputation as a brilliant mechanic but poor businessman. At 38 years old, Henry Ford was becoming known in Detroit as a man who could build remarkable vehicles but couldn't run a profitable company. The failures taught him something crucial. The The wealthy buyers who could afford expensive automobiles wanted luxury and status. Soft leather seats, polished brass fixtures, hand-fitted components. Building such vehicles required skilled craftsmen working slowly, making each automobile essentially unique. The mathematics didn't work. Labor costs exceeded revenue potential. You couldn't make money building carriages for the rich. But what if you built carriages for everyone? What if you designed a vehicle so simple and standardized that unskilled workers could assemble it quickly? What if you manufactured thousands of identical automobiles instead of dozens of unique ones? The price per unit would drop. The market would expand. The mathematics might actually work. This insight violated everything Detroit's automotive establishment believed. In 1902, approximately 600 different automobile companies existed in America and Europe, virtually all of them building expensive vehicles in small quantities for wealthy customers. The industry assumed automobiles would remain luxury goods, like yachts or private railroad cars. Henry Ford was developing a different vision: automobiles as democratic technology, available to working families, transforming society through mass availability rather than elite exclusivity. But before he could pursue that vision, he needed credibility. He needed to prove himself to potential investors. And in 1902, there was only one way for an automotive engineer to gain credibility: racing. Henry built race cars, not for sport but for marketing. He designed a massive engine, producing 70 horsepower, 17 times more powerful than his original vehicle. He mounted it on a stripped chassis, with minimal body and enormous wheels. The result was terrifying: a vehicle that exceeded 80 miles per hour on straightaways but had minimal braking and marginal steering control. In October 1902, before 10,000 spectators at a horse racing track in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, Henry Ford drove his race car against Alexander Winton, America's most successful automotive manufacturer and racing champion. Winton led for most of the 10-mile race, but his more sophisticated vehicle developed mechanical problems in the final laps. Henry, driving with reckless determination, passed him to win. The victory meant nothing for engineering, but everything for reputation. Newspapers covered it. Detroit's business community noticed. Potential investors saw that Henry Ford could build automobiles that performed. Within weeks, the coal dealer Alexander Malcolmson approached Henry about forming yet another automobile company. But this time would be different. This time Henry had learned from his failures. This time he would build for the many, not the few. And this time he would encounter opposition that would require 6 years and a Supreme Court decision to overcome. In August 1903, Thomas Edison came to Detroit for a convention of electrical illuminating companies. Henry Ford, still an Edison illuminating employee despite his automotive ambitions, attended a dinner where the 66-year-old inventor held court. During the meal, someone mentioned Ford's experiments with gasoline engines, and Edison asked to hear more. Henry explained his vision: not automobiles as luxury goods, but as universal transportation. Vehicles simple enough for farmers to repair, durable enough for rural roads, affordable enough for working families. He described standardized manufacturing, interchangeable parts, volume production, driving down costs until owning an automobile became ordinary rather than exceptional. Edison listened, asked questions, demanded details about engine design and manufacturing processes. Then, at the end of Henry's explanation, Edison pounded his fist on the table so hard that dishes rattled. "Young man, that's the thing!" Edison shouted. "You have it! Keep at it! Electric cars must keep near to power stations. The storage battery is too heavy. Steam cars won't do either, for they require a boiler and fire. Your car is self-contained, carries its own power plant. No fire, no boiler, no smoke, and no steam. You have the thing. Keep at it. The greatest inventor of the age, the man who had given the world electric light and phonographs and motion pictures, was validating Henry Ford's vision. In a room full of successful businessmen, Thomas Edison was telling everyone that this failed company founder had discovered something important. Henry left that dinner with renewed determination. He had an ally in Edison, though the two would rarely interact again. He had investors in Malcolmson and others who had witnessed Edison's endorsement. And he had a vision that differed fundamentally from every other automotive manufacturer in America. He would build a car for the great multitude, a car that any person with a decent salary could afford, a car that would open country roads to millions who had never traveled beyond their immediate communities, a car that would transform America from a nation of isolated farms and towns into a mobile, connected society. But first, he would have to win the greatest legal battle in automotive history against an organization that claimed to own the very concept of the gasoline-powered automobile. The Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers claimed to own the future, not through innovation or engineering superiority, but through a single patent issued to George Selden in 1895. Selden, a patent attorney who had never manufactured a successful automobile, had filed a patent application in 1879 covering a vehicle powered by an internal combustion engine. Through legal maneuvering, he kept that application pending for 16 years, allowing the patent's language to evolve as automobile technology developed. When the patent finally issued, it was broad enough to cover virtually any gasoline-powered road vehicle. The association purchased rights to the Selden patent and proceeded to enforce it ruthlessly. Any company wanting to manufacture automobiles in America needed a license from the association. The license required payment of 1.25% of every vehicle's retail price, PS, a perpetual tax on an entire industry, paid to men who had invented nothing. By 1903, the association controlled American automobile manufacturing. Nearly 300 companies had taken licenses, accepting the royalty burden rather than face expensive litigation. The association portrayed itself as protecting legitimate manufacturers from fraudulent operators. In reality, it was extracting wealth from an emerging industry through legal monopoly. When Henry Ford and his investors formed the Ford Motor Company in June 1903, they applied for an association license. Standard procedure. Every legitimate manufacturer needed one. The application detailed the company's capital, its manufacturing plans, its engineering capabilities. The association rejected Ford's application. Their stated reason was that Ford Motor Company lacked sufficient capital and manufacturing experience to succeed. The real reason was more cynical. The association didn't want too many manufacturers competing for limited market share. Better to control who entered the industry, maintaining prices and profits for existing license holders. Henry Ford faced a choice: abandon his company before manufacturing a single vehicle, or operate without a license and face inevitable litigation from an organization that had already demonstrated willingness to destroy non-compliant manufacturers through the courts. He chose to fight. Understand what this meant. Ford Motor Company had initial capital of $28,000, YFA, barely sufficient to begin manufacturing, certainly insufficient to fund years of legal battles against wealthy opponents. Henry owned 255 shares out of 12,000 total, giving him minority ownership in his own company. If the association sued and won, Ford Motor Company would be destroyed and Henry would be personally bankrupt. But the patent itself was questionable. Selden had never built a working vehicle. His patent described an engine using the Brayton cycle, IMDA, a type of internal combustion engine that had proven impractical and was virtually obsolete by 1903. Modern automobiles, including Ford's, used the Otto cycle engine, a fundamentally different design with different thermodynamics and different operating principles. Henry believed the Selden patent was invalid, that it didn't cover modern automobiles, and that the association was perpetrating a fraud on the entire industry. He announced publicly that Ford Motor Company would manufacture without a license, that he would defend any customers sued by the association, and that he would fight the patent in court until it was overturned. The association sued in October 1903. The case of Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers versus Ford Motor Company would consume 6 years, generate over 14,000 pages of testimony, and determine whether American automobile manufacturing would be controlled by patent monopoly or open competition. While lawyers prepared arguments, Henry built automobiles. The first Ford, the Model A, not to be confused with the later more famous Model A, emerged from the Mack Avenue plant in July 1903. A simple vehicle with an 8-horsepower 2-cylinder engine, planetary transmission, and wooden body mounted on a steel frame. It seated 2 passengers and cost $850. Heavy sex, expensive for working families, but far cheaper than competitors' vehicles offering similar performance. The Model A succeeded because Henry had finally learned to balance engineering ambition with manufacturing practicality. Instead of handcrafting each vehicle as a unique creation, Ford standardized components. Instead of making everything in-house, he purchased parts from suppliers who could produce them more efficiently. Instead of targeting wealthy buyers, he marketed to middle-class families and rural doctors and small-town businessmen who needed reliable transportation. Within 15 months, Ford Motor Company sold over 1,700 Model A automobiles and accumulated surplus capital of $100,000. The struggling startup became a viable business while defending itself against the association's lawsuit. But Henry wasn't satisfied with the Model A. Too heavy, at 1,250 pounds. Too complex for non-mechanics to maintain. Too expensive for truly mass adoption. He followed it with the Model B, Model C, Model F, Model K, Model N, each one teaching him something about what customers wanted and what manufacturing could efficiently provide. The Model N, introduced in 1906 at $500, came closest to Henry's vision. A lightweight vehicle with a 4-cylinder 15-horsepower engine, simple controls, adequate performance. Ford sold over 7,000 Model Ns in 2 years, proving that a low-priced, standardized automobile could be profitable through volume rather than margin. Yet Henry kept refining his concept. The perfect car, the universal car, still eluded him. It needed to be lighter than the Model N, stronger than the Model N, simpler than the Model N, and somehow cheaper than the Model N, despite being superior in every way. The breakthrough came from a wrecked race car. In 1905, a French automobile crashed during a race in Florida. Henry's assistants examined the wreckage and discovered that critical components were made from vanadium steel, an alloy virtually unknown in American manufacturing. Vanadium steel, using the rare element vanadium as an alloying agent, possessed almost 3 times the tensile strength of conventional steel while weighing no more. Imagine what this meant for automotive design. A frame member made from vanadium steel could be 1/3 the size of a conventional steel member, yet provide equal strength. An entire vehicle could be lighter, using less material, consuming less fuel, performing better, yet remaining as durable as heavier competitors. But no American steel mill produced vanadium steel in 1905. The alloy was exotic, difficult to manufacture, expensive. If Ford wanted vanadium steel, he would have to create an American supply chain from nothing. Henry found a small steel mill in Canton, Ohio, willing to attempt vanadium steel production. He provided capital for the necessary equipment modifications. He sent his metallurgists to work with their metallurgists, transferring knowledge about heat treatment and chemistry and quality control. Within 18 months, American manufacturers could produce vanadium steel in quantities sufficient for automobile manufacturing. This steel would enable the vehicle Henry had been imagining since his racing days. A car weighing just 1,200 pounds, lighter than the Model N despite being larger. A car using vanadium steel in every critical component: AD frame, axles, springs, crankshaft, transmission gears. A car strong enough to handle America's terrible rural roads, yet light enough to achieve 25 miles per gallon. While Ford's engineers developed vanadium steel supply chains and refined engine designs, the patent trial continued. The association presented expert witnesses testifying that the Selden patent covered all gasoline automobiles. Ford's lawyers countered that Selden's engine design was obsolete and fundamentally different from modern engines. Testimony explored minute details of thermodynamic cycles, compression ratios, valve timing, ignition systems, technical minutiae that would determine the fate of an entire industry. In September 1909, Judge Charles Merrill Huff ruled in favor of the association. The Selden patent was valid and covered all gasoline-powered automobiles manufactured in America. Ford Motor Company was guilty of patent infringement and must cease manufacturing immediately or obtain a license from the association. The decision threatened to destroy everything Henry had built. 6 years of legal battle seemingly ended in defeat. The association announced that Ford dealers and customers would be sued for handling and purchasing illegal vehicles. Newspapers portrayed Ford as a thief stealing patented technology. Henry Ford issued a public statement that became famous in automotive history. He would appeal the decision, he would continue manufacturing, and he would personally guarantee every Ford customer against losses from association lawsuits. The statement took out full-page newspaper advertisements. "We will protect you against any prosecution for alleged infringement of patents." It was a staggering commitment. If the appeal failed, Ford would be personally liable for defending thousands of customers in individual lawsuits. He was betting everything, his company, his fortune, his reputation, on the belief that the patent was invalid. The appeal to the circuit court would take 4 more years. During that time, Henry Ford needed to do more than just survive. He needed to create something so remarkable that even if he lost the legal battle, the world would remember what he'd accomplished. He needed to build the Model T. By 1907, Henry had settled on the essential specifications. The engine would be a 4-cylinder 20-horsepower unit made almost entirely from vanadium steel, developing maximum torque at low speeds for pulling through mud and climbing hills. The transmission would be planetary, simple, reliable, only 2 forward speeds but infinitely variable through a pedal-controlled friction band system that required no gear-shifting skill. The suspension would be transverse leaf springs mounted high, giving 9 inches of ground clearance to clear the deep ruts of farm roads. The body would be steel over wooden framing, ugly but functional, with no unnecessary decoration. Most critically, every component would be standardized and interchangeable. A cylinder head from one Model T would fit any other Model T. A farmer in Wyoming could order replacement parts by mail and install them with basic tools. No automotive expertise required. The car would be designed not for mechanics in cities but for ordinary people in rural America, where no mechanics existed. The target price was revolutionary: $500. No automobile with equivalent capability sold for less than $800. The association's licensed manufacturers insisted that $500 was impossible without sacrificing quality or taking losses. Henry believed that volume manufacturing could achieve what craftsmanship could not: low prices through standardization and efficiency. On October 1st, 1908, the first Model T emerged from the Piquette Avenue plant in Detroit. A tall, angular vehicle that looked almost comical compared to the low, streamlined automobiles wealthy buyers preferred. It weighed exactly 1,200 pounds despite seating 5 passengers. It could achieve 45 miles per hour on good roads, yet climb steep grades in low gear at walking pace. Started reliably. No hand cranking for 10 minutes hoping the engine would fire. It handled terrible roads that stopped other automobiles completely. The initial price was $825, higher than Henry's target but still far below competing vehicles' prices. He announced that as production increased, the price would decrease. Every year, Model Ts would become cheaper, not more expensive. This violated every business principle of the era. Henry 44. Successful products traditionally increased in price as manufacturers added features and exploited market position. Henry was promising the opposite. Orders overwhelmed production capacity immediately. Within weeks, Ford had orders for thousands of Model Ts, with delivery times stretching months into the future. Dealers across America wanted to sell Ford vehicles. Customers who had never considered automobile ownership saw the Model T as finally affordable, but producing thousands of identical vehicles monthly required manufacturing innovations that didn't yet exist. The Piquette Avenue plant, designed for building hundreds of vehicles annually through traditional craftsmanship, couldn't scale to the demand Henry envisioned. He needed a new factory, a revolutionary factory, a factory that would manufacture automobiles the way Edison's plants manufactured light bulbs, Edison's continuously, efficiently, in vast quantities. Highland Park, a Detroit suburb, provided the location. Henry commissioned architect Albert Kahn to design something unprecedented, a 4-story factory with walls of glass, natural light flooding every workspace, open floor plans, allowing materials to flow without obstruction. No dark corners where workers strained to see, no cramped spaces where inventory accumulated. A cathedral to manufacturing, built with the same care that medieval builders devoted to churches. The new Highland Park plant opened in 1910, covering 62 acres, employing over 4,000 workers, capable of producing 200 Model Ts daily. But Henry's ambition exceeded even this capacity. 200 per day meant 50,000 per year. He wanted to build 100,000 per year, then 200,000, then more. The mathematics seemed impossible. Traditional automotive manufacturing required skilled craftsmen working at individual stations, fitting components together through experienced judgment about tolerances and alignment. Each car was slightly different because handwork was inherently variable. Production speed was limited by the slowest craftsmen, and hiring more craftsmen didn't proportionally increase output because coordination problems multiplied with workforce size. Henry studied other industries looking for principles he could adapt. Flour mills processed continuous flows of grain through standardized steps. Meat packers used disassembly lines, where carcasses moved past workers who each performed one task repeatedly. Breweries refined raw materials into finished product through sequential processes, each step feeding the next. What if automobile manufacturing worked the same way? What if cars moved through the factory while workers remained stationary? What if each worker performed one small task repeatedly instead of completing entire assemblies? What if human workers became components in a larger machine, each person a specialized cell in an industrial organism? The idea would transform manufacturing. It would make Henry Ford the wealthiest industrialist in America. It would create the middle class and enable mass consumption. And it would spark controversy that would eventually turn Ford's greatest triumph into his most troubling legacy. But first, in January 1911, the Circuit Court of Appeals would rule on the Selden patent case, determining whether Ford Motor Company would survive to implement Henry's revolutionary manufacturing vision. On January 9, 1911, the Circuit Court of Appeals delivered its verdict. The Selden patent was valid, but it only covered automobiles using the obsolete Brayton cycle engine. Ford's vehicles using the Otto cycle engine did not infringe. After 8 years of litigation, Henry Ford had won completely. The association's monopoly collapsed. American automobile manufacturing was freed from patent control, but Henry barely celebrated the victory. He was already obsessed with the next impossible challenge, transforming Highland Park into a factory that could manufacture 1,000 Model Ts daily. Consider the magneto, a small generator providing electrical current for spark plugs. In 1912, one skilled worker could assemble a complete magneto in 20 minutes, selecting components from bins, fitting them together using hand tools and practiced judgment. 20 minutes meant each worker produced 3 magnetos per hour, 24 per day. To supply 1,000 automobiles daily required assembling 1,000 magnetos, requiring over 40 skilled workers just for this single component. Henry's production engineers, led by William Knudsen and Charles Sorensen, began experimenting with a different approach. They divided magneto assembly into 29 individual operations. One worker installed the magnets, another positioned the coils, a third secured the mounting bolts. Each worker performed one task repeatedly, developing speed and precision through constant repetition. The specialized workers assembled magnetos faster than the generalists, 14 minutes instead of 20. Better, but not revolutionary. Then someone suggested moving the magnetos past stationary workers instead of having workers move to fetch components. They mounted magnetos on a waist-high platform and pulled them along using a rope, each worker performing their operation as the unit passed. Assembly time dropped to 7 minutes. Same workers, same components, simply reorganized around flow, rather than individual completion. They tried pulling the platform mechanically at a controlled pace. Workers no longer waited for the previous person to finish. The magnetos arrived at precise intervals, the mechanical rhythm determining work pace. Assembly time dropped to 5 minutes. 5 minutes. One worker could now produce 12 magnetos per hour instead of 3. A 400% productivity increase without working harder or faster, simply by reorganizing how work flowed through the factory. This was the principle that would reshape industrial civilization. Not the assembly line itself, yes, prod. Continuous production had existed in other industries for decades, but applying it to complex manufactured goods, dividing sophisticated assembly into simple repetitive tasks, using mechanical pacing to drive productivity, named EC, this was new. This was revolutionary. Within months, Ford's engineers applied the moving assembly principle to every component. Engine blocks moved past workers, who each installed specific parts. Chassis frames rolled through stations, where workers added axles, springs, steering components. Sub-assemblies fed into main assembly lines in perfectly synchronized timing, like tributaries flowing into a great river. The metaphor was apt. Highland Park became an industrial watershed where raw materials flowed in through multiple channels, converged through increasingly complex combinations, and emerged as finished automobiles in a continuous mechanical current. The factory operated like a living organism. Materials were nutrients flowing through an industrial bloodstream, workers were specialized cells performing dedicated functions, and automobiles were the organism's output, its reason for existence. By April 1913, Ford installed the first complete chassis assembly line. The chassis, the fundamental platform onto which everything else attached, previously required 12.5 hours to assemble at stationary stations. Workers would gather around a frame, installing engine, transmission, axles, wheels, steering, in whatever sequence seemed logical, each team working independently. The moving chassis line transported frames past 84 sequential workstations. At each station, workers performed one specific task: installing motor mounts at station 12, attaching the transmission at station 37, mounting the radiator at station 61. Components arrived at each station at precisely the right moment, delivered by sub-assembly lines feeding the main line. The entire choreography was timed to mathematical precision. Assembly time dropped to 1 hour 33 minutes, then, with further refinement, to 93 minutes total. A complex mechanical assembly that had required most of a workday now completed in 93 minutes of continuous motion. Highland Park produced over 1,000 Model Ts daily by late 1913. The price dropped to $550, then $500, then $440. Every price reduction increased demand, which justified further production increases, which enabled further price reductions. The feedback loop Henry had imagined was becoming reality. But Highland Park, revolutionary as it was, remained incomplete. Ford still depended on outside suppliers for steel, glass, rubber, paint, and hundreds of other materials. Each supplier operated independently, shipping components on their own schedules, with their own quality standards, charging prices that reduced Ford's profit margins. Every external dependency meant potential delays, quality problems, and costs Henry couldn't control. His solution was audacious, even by his own standards. He would build a factory that consumed raw materials and produced finished automobiles without any external suppliers. A completely vertical manufacturing complex where iron ore entered one end and Model Ts drove out the other. River Rouge, in Dearborn on the banks of the Detroit River, provided the location. Henry began purchasing land in 1915, eventually accumulating over 2,000 acres. The scale of his vision staggered even experienced industrialists. River Rouge would include blast furnaces to convert iron ore into pig iron, steel mills to convert pig iron into sheet steel, rolling mills to form steel into specific shapes, a glass plant to manufacture windows and windshields, a tire factory to produce rubber, a power plant generating electricity for the entire complex, warehouses, foundries, assembly lines, machine shops, rombles, everything required to transform raw earth into transportation. Construction began in 1917 and continued through the 1920s. At completion, River Rouge covered over 1,600 acres under roof, tension 16 million square feet of manufacturing space. 100,000 workers operated the complex at peak employment. The facility had its own deep water port where freighters delivered iron ore from Minnesota, coal from Pennsylvania, limestone from Michigan quarries. Over 100 miles of railroad track moved materials between buildings. The complex consumed enough electricity daily to power a city of 500,000 people. River Rouge was more than a factory. It was a manifestation of Ford's ultimate manufacturing principle: complexity divided by standardization equals exponential efficiency. Every component standardized, every process refined to mechanical precision. Vertical integration eliminating external dependencies. The result was efficiency at a scale that would have seemed impossible in 1903 when Henry built his first Model A. By 1920, Highland Park and River Rouge together produced 4,000 Model Ts daily. By 1923, 7,000 daily. By 1925, 9,000 daily, one complete automobile every 10 seconds during operating hours. Over 15 million Model Ts would ultimately be manufactured, making it the best-selling vehicle in history until the 1970s. The achievement was staggering. In 1908, the entire American automobile industry produced 63,000 vehicles. By 1925, Ford alone produced over 2 million vehicles annually, more than the entire industry had produced 17 years earlier. One company, using principles Henry Ford developed, had transformed automotive manufacturing from craft to mass production. But efficiency at this scale extracted costs. Workers on the assembly line performed the same motion every 10 seconds for 9 hours daily. Install a bolt, tighten a nut, attach a component, thousands of repetitions daily, each one identical to the last, each one contributing one tiny fraction to a finished automobile the worker would never complete individually. The work was mind-numbing. Turnover reached 300% annually in 1913. Ford, Two needed to hire 300 workers to maintain 100 positions because workers kept quitting. Training new workers constantly disrupted production. Quality suffered when inexperienced workers made mistakes. The mathematical efficiency of the assembly line was being undermined by human beings who couldn't tolerate the dehumanizing repetition. Henry Ford needed to solve this problem. The assembly line required workers who would stay, who would master their simple tasks, who would become reliable components in the industrial machine. The solution he developed would be as revolutionary as the assembly line itself, triggering riots in Detroit and fundamentally altering the relationship between American workers and industrial capitalism. But it would also plant the seeds of darkness that would eventually consume Henry Ford's later years, transforming him from liberator to tyrant, from visionary to villain. The same obsessive control that made him America's greatest industrialist would make him one of its most troubling figures, a man who gave workers prosperity while demanding they surrender autonomy, who created opportunity while exercising surveillance, who built an empire while destroying those closest to him. The $5 day was coming, and with it, both the peak of Ford's achievement and the beginning of his descent. January 5, 1914, Ford Motor Company announced that it would pay workers $5 for an 8-hour day, effective immediately. Not just supervisors or skilled workers, every employee on the assembly line, regardless of skill level or seniority. $5 daily when the industry standard was $2.30 for a 9-hour day, more than double the prevailing wage while reducing working hours. The announcement detonated across Detroit like dynamite. Within hours, thousands of job seekers mobbed Highland Park's employment office. By dawn the next morning, 10,000 men crowded outside the factory gates in -11-degree Fahrenheit weather, desperate for Ford jobs. Police tried to control the crowd, but were overwhelmed by the sheer mass of humanity pressing forward. The mob grew increasingly aggressive as rumors spread that Ford was hiring immediately. Fights broke out. People were crushed against factory walls. The situation spiraled toward riot. Detroit police turned fire hoses on the crowd. In below-freezing temperatures, water blasted desperate men who had stood for hours hoping for employment. Ice formed on clothing instantly. Men slipped and fell on streets, turning to frozen sheets. The crowd finally dispersed, leaving scores injured, and Highland Park's gates crusted with ice. The $5 day wasn't charity. Henry Ford had calculated that doubling wages would reduce turnover, improve morale, and increase productivity enough to offset the increased labor costs. But he'd also recognized something more profound. Workers needed to afford the products they manufactured. If assembly line workers couldn't buy automobiles, the market for Model Ts would remain artificially limited to the wealthy. But if workers earned enough to become customers, the market became virtually unlimited. This was revolutionary economics. Pay workers not just enough to survive, but enough to consume. Create a feedback loop where wages enabled consumption, which justified production, which created employment, which enabled more consumption. The prosperity that resulted would be self-sustaining, growing exponentially as more workers joined the consumer economy. Within months, Detroit transformed. Ford workers bought automobiles, often Model Ts they'd helped assemble. They purchased houses, taking mortgages they could now afford. They bought furniture, clothing, household appliances. Their consumption created demand that required other workers to produce more goods, spreading prosperity through the entire local economy. Other Detroit manufacturers, facing worker shortages as employees fled to Ford, were forced to raise wages to compete. The entire wage structure of industrial Detroit shifted upward. The Ford worker became a new social category, not wealthy but not poor, able to afford modest comforts while saving for future security. The emerging middle class, though the term wasn't yet common, found its archetype in the Highland Park assembly line worker who drove his own automobile to work. But the $5 day came with conditions. Not every worker qualified. Ford established a sociological department, employing 50 investigators who visited workers' homes to verify they met company standards for receiving the full wage. The investigators checked whether workers lived in clean, orderly homes, whether they were legally married if living with women, whether they drank excessively or gambled, whether they demonstrated proper American values. Immigrant workers faced particular scrutiny. Detroit's factories employed thousands of recent arrivals from Poland, Italy, Hungary, Russia, Lithuania, men who spoke little English and maintained old country customs. The sociological department pressured them to abandon ethnic traditions, learn English, adopt American dress and behavior. Ford established English schools at Highland Park, requiring immigrant workers to attend classes teaching basic vocabulary through repetitive phrases. I am a good American. I like my work. I work hard. The graduation ceremony for these classes revealed Ford's assimilationist vision in theatrical form. Students entered a large papier-mâché melting pot wearing traditional ethnic clothing. Teachers stirred the pot with long paddles while students circled inside. Then the students emerged wearing identical American business suits, waving American flags, transformed from diverse immigrants into standardized Americans. The ceremony was sincere, not satirical. This was how Ford believed industrial society should function. Diversity melted down, standardized, made uniform. Workers accepted these intrusions because $5 daily was genuinely transformative. A Polish immigrant could send money to family in Warsaw while still saving for a house. An African-American worker from the South could earn more in Detroit than anywhere else in America. too. Ford hired black workers when most manufacturers wouldn't. The trade-off seemed acceptable. Surrender some privacy and autonomy in exchange for unprecedented prosperity. Yet the sociological department represented something troubling. Henry Ford believed he knew how workers should live, what values they should hold, how they should spend their money and organize their homes. His paternalism came from genuine concern. He wanted workers to prosper, to build stable families, to avoid the poverty and vice that plagued industrial neighborhoods. But it was paternalism nonetheless, enforced by investigators with power to reduce wages or terminate employment. The darker implications wouldn't fully emerge until later, but the seeds were planted in 1914. Ford's benevolent dictatorship worked as long as workers accepted his values and authority. What happened when workers disagreed? What happened when they wanted to organize unions to negotiate collectively rather than accept Ford's unilateral generosity? Through the 1920s, prosperity obscured these questions. Detroit boomed. Highland Park and River Rouge employed tens of thousands at wages that created comfortable lives. Model T prices continued dropping, $360 by 1925, sexisble, making automobile ownership accessible to families earning modest incomes. Ford workers became the aristocracy of labor, envied by workers in other industries who couldn't match Ford wages. The prosperity enabled new forms of consumption and entertainment. Jazz clubs proliferated in Detroit's black neighborhoods as Southern migrants brought musical traditions north and mixed them with urban sophistication. Movie theaters opened on every commercial street, offering escapism for workers who could now afford regular entertainment. Speakeasies operated openly, despite prohibition. Ford himself was a teetotaler who deplored drinking, but he couldn't control what workers did with their wages outside factory walls. Yet as the 1920s progressed, Henry Ford's character darkened. Success hadn't softened him but hardened him, convinced him that his methods were not just effective but morally superior. He became increasingly autocratic, intolerant of disagreement, certain that his instincts surpassed any expert advice. In 1919, Ford hired Harry Bennett, an ex-Navy boxer with underworld connections, initially to handle security matters. Bennett built a private force of servicemen, eventually numbering 700, who acted as Ford's personal enforcers. They weren't police or security guards in any conventional sense. They were thugs, recruited from prisons and street gangs, loyal only to Bennett and Ford, operating with complete impunity within Ford facilities. Bennett's servicemen spied on workers, reporting anyone who expressed pro-union sympathies or criticized company policies. They intimidated foremen who questioned orders. They physically threatened anyone Bennett or Ford considered troublesome. The servicemen represented Ford's desire for total control over his empire, enforced through fear rather than loyalty. Labor organizing efforts, minimal in the prosperous 1920s, intensified during the Depression. By the mid-1930s, the United Auto Workers Union successfully organized General Motors and Chrysler. Ford alone resisted, with Henry personally directing the campaign against unionization. He genuinely believed unions would destroy the direct relationship between company and workers that he'd built through the $5 day. He saw unions as outside agitators interfering with his benevolent management. On May 26, 1937, UAW organizers planned to distribute leaflets at River Rouge's gates. It was legal activity, protected by the National Labor Relations Act, but Ford's servicemen, led by Bennett's men, were waiting. As organizers climbed an overpass leading to the gate, Bennett's thugs attacked. The organizers were beaten savagely, while newspaper photographers captured everything. The photographs showed men being kicked while lying defenseless on the ground. Bloody faces, torn clothing, the brutal suppression of legal union activity by a company that claimed to care about worker welfare. The Battle of the Overpass, as it became known, destroyed what remained of Henry Ford's progressive reputation. The man who had revolutionized worker pay in 1914 now employed private police to beat union organizers in 1937. The liberator had become the oppressor. Ford was eventually forced to recognize the UAW in 1941, the last major automaker to accept unionization. But the damage to his legacy was permanent. History would remember both the $5 day that created middle-class prosperity and the Battle of the Overpass that revealed how far Ford would go to maintain absolute control. The tragedy was that Ford's early instincts had been correct. Workers did need higher wages to become consumers. Mass production did require mass consumption. The prosperity Ford created was real and substantial, but he couldn't accept that workers might legitimately want collective representation. He couldn't tolerate any challenge to his authority. The same stubborn determination that drove him to defeat the Selden patent, to perfect the assembly line, to build River Rouge, also made him increasingly tyrannical as he aged. By the late 1930s, Henry Ford was becoming a tragic figure, still brilliant in moments, still capable of mechanical insights that amazed engineers, but increasingly erratic, paranoid, cruel. His treatment of workers was merely the most public manifestation of character flaws that would devastate his family and nearly destroy the company he'd built. The $5 day had promised a better world where industrial workers shared in the prosperity they created. For a time, that promise was fulfilled. Detroit became a beacon of working-class prosperity, proving that capitalism could benefit workers and owners simultaneously. But the promise was conditional on accepting Ford's absolute authority, his vision of proper living, his right to control every aspect of his workers' lives. When workers demanded autonomy alongside prosperity, when they insisted on rights rather than accepting benevolence, Ford responded with violence. The man who had elevated thousands of workers into comfortable middle-class lives also beat those who questioned his authority. Both truths must be held simultaneously to understand Henry Ford, a facer, visionary and tyrant, liberator and oppressor, the architect of American prosperity and the symbol of its costs. The assembly line had created unprecedented productivity. The $5 day had created unprecedented worker prosperity. But both systems required workers to surrender autonomy, to become components in machines they didn't control, to accept conditions dictated from above without meaningful input. This tension, between prosperity and autonomy, between efficiency and dignity, between industrial progress and human agency, would define American manufacturing through the 20th century. Ford had discovered that you could pay workers well while controlling them completely. He never understood that workers might prefer less control, even at the cost of some prosperity. That incomprehension, that certainty that he knew what was best for everyone, would poison his final decades and transform American industrialism's greatest success story into a cautionary tale about the costs of unchecked power. By 1926, the Model T had become a fossil. Not technically obsolete, it still functioned perfectly for its designed purpose of basic, reliable transportation. But America had changed. The country that desperately needed affordable automobiles in 1908 now wanted automobiles that expressed personality, status, aspiration. The Model T, unchanging for 18 years, offered only utility. General Motors understood this transformation. Under Alfred Sloan's leadership, GM offered a car for every purse and purpose, Chevrolets for working families, Pontiacs for the aspiring middle class, Oldsmobiles for successful professionals, Buicks for the wealthy, Cadillacs for the elite. 5 brands, dozens of models, frequent styling updates, colors beyond black. GM was selling not just transportation but identity. Henry Ford famously declared that customers could have any color they wanted, so long as it's black. The quote was meant to emphasize standardization's efficiency. Instead, it became a symbol of Ford's refusal to acknowledge that customers wanted choice. Black paint dried fastest, enabling the assembly line to run without delays. Therefore, all Model Ts were black. The logic was impeccable, but the psychology was disastrous. By 1926, Chevrolet outsold the Model T for the first time. The vehicle that had dominated American automobile sales for nearly 2 decades was losing market share to a competitor, offering variety and style. Dealers begged Ford to update the Model T or introduce a new model. Engineers showed him designs for improved vehicles. His son Edsel, now president of Ford Motor Company, pleaded with him to modernize. Henry refused. The Model T was perfect for its purpose. Customers who wanted frivolous styling and unnecessary features didn't understand automobiles. He'd built 15 million Model Ts by perfecting a single design. Why abandon success? But success was already abandoned. By mid-1927, Model T sales had collapsed. Ford was losing money on every vehicle manufactured. Dealers were defecting to competitors. Workers at Highland Park and River Rouge feared layoffs. The company that had revolutionized manufacturing was being destroyed by its founders' stubborn refusal to accept that markets evolve. Finally, in May 1927, Henry Ford announced that Model T production would cease. After 19 years and 15 million vehicles, the most successful automobile in history would be discontinued. Ford Motor Company would close its factories for 6 months to retool for a completely new vehicle, the Model A. The shutdown was catastrophic. Highland Park and River Rouge went silent. 60,000 workers were laid off without pay. Ford provided no unemployment benefits or severance. The assembly lines that had thundered continuously for years stood motionless. Machinery that had been designed specifically for Model T production became instantly worthless. The entire physical plant required reconstruction for the new model. Ford lost approximately $1 million daily during the shutdown, over $150 million total, NESEC, and staggering sum equivalent to billions in modern currency. Dealers who had invested in Ford franchises panicked as inventory disappeared and no new vehicles arrived. Many abandoned Ford for other manufacturers, taking their customer relationships with them. Yet Henry seemed almost indifferent to the financial catastrophe. He'd made his decision. The Model T was finished. The Model A would vindicate him. Everything else was merely the cost of transition. The new Model A, revealed on December 2nd, 1927, caused a sensation. Over 1 million Americans mobbed Ford dealerships to see it. Police in major cities required crowd control. In New York, 100,000 people crushed into showrooms. In Detroit, mounted police managed crowds. The Model A generated more public excitement than any consumer product in American history. The vehicle itself was genuinely impressive. Modern styling that looked contemporary rather than dated. 4-cylinder engine producing 40 horsepower, 10 A's, double the Model T's output. 3-speed transmission instead of 2. Hydraulic shock absorbers for smoother ride, available in multiple colors and body styles. Everything customers had wanted from Ford and been denied for years. The Model A succeeded commercially, selling over 4 million units through 1932. It proved that Ford Motor Company could create modern vehicles that competed with General Motors' offerings. But the damage from the 6-month shutdown was permanent. Ford's market dominance was broken. GM became America's largest automaker, a position it would hold for decades. Ford had demonstrated that even revolutionary companies could be toppled by failing to evolve. But Ford Motor Company's struggles were symptoms of a deeper problem: MD Ford's psychological deterioration. The man who had been brilliant and determined in his youth became increasingly erratic, paranoid, and cruel as he aged. His treatment of his son Edsel illustrated the darkness consuming him. Edsel Ford was talented, a trained engineer with genuine design sense and business acumen. As company president, he understood that Ford needed to modernize, diversify, and respond to market changes. He pushed for styling updates, new models, professional management systems. Henry systematically undermined him. In meetings, Henry would override Edsel's decisions publicly, humiliating him in front of subordinates. He'd approve Edsel's projects, then cancel them arbitrarily. He sided with Harry Bennett against Edsel in internal disputes, empowering the thug while diminishing his own son. The cruelty seemed deliberate, as if Henry resented Edsel for possessing qualities he lacked: social grace, design sensitivity, managerial sophistication. Edsel developed stomach ulcers from the stress. His health declined through the 1930s. Henry showed no sympathy, viewing illness as weakness. When Edsel died in 1943, at age 49, many believed his father had essentially killed him through relentless psychological abuse. Henry Ford had murdered his son as surely as if he'd used violence, destroying him slowly through contempt and domination. Henry's anti-Semitism represented another manifestation of his darkening character. In 1920, he purchased the Dearborn Independent newspaper and began publishing a series of articles titled "The International Jew, the World's Problem." Over 91 weeks, the paper promoted conspiracy theories blaming Jewish people for various social problems, labor unrest, banking practices, entertainment industry content, political movements. The articles were vile propaganda, repeating centuries-old anti-Semitic myths and presenting them as investigative journalism. They claimed Jewish conspiracies controlled global finance. They blamed Jewish influence for moral decline. They portrayed Jewish people as fundamentally different from and threatening to Christian society. Ford's prominence gave these views widespread circulation. The Dearborn Independent had national distribution. The articles were collected and published as a book that sold in Germany during the 1920s and influenced Nazi ideology. Adolf Hitler praised Henry Ford in Mein Kampf. In 1938, Nazi Germany awarded Ford the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor available to foreigners. Ford eventually retracted the articles in 1927 after Jewish organizations sued for libel. But the retraction was tactical rather than sincere. Proof: He needed Jewish cooperation for business purposes, not because his views had changed. His anti-Semitism persisted privately even after the public apology. Understanding this aspect of Ford's character is essential to understanding his complete legacy. He wasn't merely flawed or occasionally prejudiced. He actively promoted hatred, using his wealth and influence to spread conspiracy theories that contributed to the ideological foundation of genocide. The same man who gave prosperity to millions also gave intellectual support to murderous bigotry. How do we reconcile these contradictions? The visionary who saw that workers needed to be consumers, the industrialist who created middle-class prosperity, the engineer who perfected assembly line manufacturing, the bigot who published anti-Semitic propaganda, the father who psychologically destroyed his son, the liberator who employed private police to beat union organizers. Perhaps Ford's tragedy was that his greatest strengths became his greatest weaknesses as he aged. The stubborn determination that enabled him to fight the Selden patent became rigid refusal to evolve the Model T. The paternal concern that created the $5 day became intrusive control through the sociological department. The mechanical brilliance that built revolutionary factories became obsessive micromanagement that paralyzed decision-making. The confidence that drove innovation became arrogance that rejected all advice. By the early 1940s, Ford Motor Company was approaching collapse despite superficial prosperity. Henry, now nearly 80, still insisted on controlling major decisions despite clear mental decline. He trusted Harry Bennett more than his own executives. He'd driven away talented managers who couldn't tolerate the chaotic, autocratic environment. The company had no succession plan, no modern management systems, no clear strategy beyond Henry's increasingly erratic instincts. When Edsel died in 1943, the succession crisis became acute. Henry reassumed the presidency at age 79, despite being clearly unable to manage the complexity of wartime production. Ford Motor Company was manufacturing bombers, tanks, engines for military use, critical war production that couldn't tolerate the inefficiency and chaos Henry's management created. The federal government considered nationalizing Ford Motor Company to ensure war production continued. Military officials believed Henry Ford had become a liability to national defense. Only the intervention of Henry's wife Clara and Edsel's widow Eleanor prevented complete disaster. They demanded that Henry's grandson, Henry Ford II, be released from Navy service to run the company. They threatened divorce and public scandal if Henry didn't step aside. Faced with family revolt and potential government takeover, Henry finally relented. In September 1945, Henry Ford II became president of Ford Motor Company at age 28. His first act was firing Harry Bennett, ending the reign of terror that had poisoned the company for decades. His second act was hiring professional managers, Flom, the famous whiz kids, including Robert McNamara, who implemented modern management, systems that Henry Ford Sr. had always rejected. The elder Henry Ford died on April 7, 1947, at age 83. He died at Fair Lane, his Dearborn estate, during a power outage caused by flooding. By candlelight and oil lamps, the illumination technologies that had been standard when he was born, the man who had revolutionized transportation passed from a world he'd helped create but no longer understood. In his final months, he'd still sketch engine designs, his mind returning to the mechanical problems that had fascinated him as a boy. The farm he'd escaped still stood, now surrounded by the industrial empire he'd built. The pocket watch his mother had given him remained in his possession, carried daily even after his mind had dimmed. Henry Ford's life contained multitudes, revolutionary and reactionary, generous and cruel, brilliant and bigoted. He'd elevated millions while destroying those closest to him. He'd created prosperity while demanding submission. He'd seen the future clearly in 1908 but couldn't see it at all in 1926. Perhaps that's the lesson. Vision that transforms the world in one era can become blindness that destroys in the next. The skills required for creation differ from those required for stewardship, and power, especially unchecked power, corrupts even the most visionary into tyrants who cannot distinguish their personal will from universal truth. The boy who feared the farm had built an empire. The empire had eventually consumed him as surely as the farm would have. The only difference was that his consumption affected millions of lives rather than just his own. The assembly line didn't die with Henry Ford. It replicated, evolved, spread through every industry where efficiency mattered and standardization was possible. Ford's fundamental insight, SLUSA, that complexity divided by standardization equals exponential efficiency, became the operating principle of modern manufacturing, transforming not just how we make things but how we live. Consider McDonald's. In 1948, brothers Richard and Maurice McDonald redesigned their San Bernardino restaurant using pure Ford principles. They analyzed hamburger preparation, divided it into sequential steps, assigned each step to a specialized worker, eliminated everything that couldn't be standardized. The result was a system that produced hamburgers in 30 seconds rather than several minutes, maintaining perfect consistency across millions of transactions. Ray Kroc recognized the revolutionary potential, just as investors had recognized Ford's potential in 1903. He franchised the system, replicating it thousands of times across America and eventually worldwide. By the 21st century, McDonald's serves billions of meals annually, each one produced through assembly line principles that would have been instantly recognizable to a Highland Park worker from 1913. The speedy service system, as the McDonald's called it, was the assembly line applied to food. Workers at Station 1 took orders. Workers at Station 2 assembled burgers. Workers at Station 3 prepared fries. The product moved through standardized steps, each worker performing one task repeatedly. Mechanical efficiency applied to biological sustenance. Ford would have approved. Manufacturing electronics followed the same path. In the 21st century, Foxconn operates factories in China, employing hundreds of thousands of workers assembling iPhones, iPads, laptops. The factories are direct descendants of River Rouge, F.A., vast integrated complexes where raw materials enter and finished products exit. An iPhone contains hundreds of components, but assembly takes minutes because each worker performs a single operation repeatedly. Insert the battery at Station 12. Attach the screen at Station 47. Install the camera at Station 73. Foxconn produces an iPhone every 3 to 5 seconds during peak production. The speed would have astonished even Henry Ford, but the principles are identical to those he developed. Standardized components, sequential assembly, specialized labor, mechanical pacing. The mathematics remains unchanged. IBDA. Divide complexity into simple repetitive tasks. Refine each task to maximum efficiency. Combine them into continuous flow. The cost per unit drops as volume increases. The very principle Ford used to reduce Model T prices from $825 to $260 now reduces iPhone costs from early models costing over $600 to manufacture to current models, costing under $400 despite vastly increased capability. Mass production conquers price, whether the product is an automobile or a smartphone. But Ford's influence extends beyond manufacturing into the physical landscape itself. The Model T required roads to travel, and roads required funding that states and the federal government initially resisted. Ford and other automobile manufacturers lobbied relentlessly for highway construction, arguing that roads were infrastructure investments that would generate economic returns. They were correct. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 created the Interstate Highway System, ESO, over 47,000 miles of limited-access highways connecting every major American city. The system cost over $114 billion in original construction, equivalent to over 500 billion in modern currency. It was the largest public works project in human history, and it existed because automobiles had become essential to American life. Those highways enabled suburbanization. Before widespread automobile ownership, people lived near their work because walking or streetcar was the only practical transportation. The automobile decoupled home from workplace. You could live 10 miles from your job, 20 miles, eventually 50 miles, commuting daily by car on highways designed for high-speed travel. By the 21st century, over 52% of Americans live in suburbs, communities that exist only because of automobiles. The suburban home with attached garage, the shopping mall surrounded by parking lots, the office park accessible only by car, these are landscapes shaped entirely by Ford's revolution. The Model T didn't just enable mobility, it restructured where and how people lived. Yet this transformation carried costs that Ford never anticipated. 2 billion automobiles now operate worldwide, burning over 100 million barrels of petroleum daily. The carbon dioxide released, approximately 24 pounds per gallon of gasoline consumed, and accumulates in Earth's atmosphere, altering the climate system that regulates temperature, precipitation, sea levels, weather patterns. The internal combustion engine, the technology that freed humanity from biological limitation, now threatens the atmospheric stability that enabled civilization. Ford's revolution succeeded so completely that its consequences endanger the world it created. The boy who escaped the farm helped build an industrial system that may make farms impossible in many regions as climate change disrupts agriculture. The irony is profound. Ford wanted to liberate humanity from the constraints of muscle-powered transportation. He succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. But liberation through fossil fuel combustion created new constraints more dangerous than the ones it removed. We gained mobility but lost atmospheric stability. We escaped the farm but endangered the climate that makes farming possible. The solution, ironically, may come through returning to Ford's own principles. Electric vehicles represent the automotive future, driven by the same forces that enabled Ford's original revolution. Battery costs have plummeted as manufacturing scales up, from over $1,000 per kilowatt-hour in 2010 to under $150 per kilowatt-hour in 2020. The cost curve follows the same trajectory as Model T prices from 1908 to 1925. Mass production conquers price, whether the product is gasoline, automobiles, or electric vehicles. Tesla, the company leading electric vehicle adoption, operates factories that would look familiar to Highland Park workers. Assembly lines moving vehicles past specialized workers. Increasing automation replacing human labor with robots. Vertical integration controlling component supply. The principles remain unchanged. Only the power source differs. Batteries and electric motors instead of gasoline and internal combustion. Ford Motor Company itself now manufactures electric vehicles, returning to the technology Thomas Edison advocated during that 1903 conversation. Edison had believed electric vehicles would dominate because they didn't require fire or boilers or complex mechanical transmissions. He was correct about the destination, merely premature about the timing. Battery technology in 1903 couldn't provide sufficient range or power. Battery technology in 2025 can. The transition to electric vehicles may ultimately prove to be Ford's most important legacy, though he couldn't have foreseen it. His assembly line methods enable their mass production. His insight that workers must become consumers creates the market for them. His vision of democratic transportation, i.e., vehicles available to ordinary families rather than elites, drives the mission to make electric vehicles affordable. Yet as we contemplate Ford's legacy, we must hold the contradictions simultaneously. The prosperity he created was real. The middle-class lifestyle he enabled transformed American society. The manufacturing principles he developed increased human capability exponentially. These achievements matter. They improved billions of lives. But the costs matter, too. The environmental damage from 2 billion gasoline vehicles, the suburban sprawl that isolated communities and increased energy consumption, the assembly line work that treated humans as interchangeable components, the autocratic management that denied workers autonomy, the bigotry he promoted and the sun he destroyed. These failures matter. They harmed millions of lives. Perhaps Ford's ultimate lesson is about the nature of progress itself. Revolutionary change solves old problems while creating new ones. The Model T liberated Americans from geographical isolation but enabled climate change. The assembly line increased productivity but dehumanized labor. The $5 day created prosperity but demanded submission. Every solution contains future problems we cannot yet perceive. The boy who escaped the farm still shapes our world. When you drive on interstate highways, you travel on infrastructure built because Ford made automobiles essential. When you purchase standardized products manufactured efficiently, you benefit from principles he developed. When you work in any industry organized around sequential processes and specialized labor, you work in systems descended from Highland Park. But you also inherit the problems his solutions created. The atmospheric carbon accumulating from transportation, the suburban landscapes requiring automobile dependency, the manufacturing systems that prioritize efficiency over human flourishing, the corporate autocracy that concentrates power and leadership resistant to accountability. Understanding Ford requires holding both realities. He was neither saint nor demon, but a complicated human whose brilliance and flaws both operated at civilization-altering scale. He saw farther than his contemporaries in some dimensions while remaining blind in others. He created while destroying, liberated while oppressing, built while breaking. The pocket watch he disassembled 70 times as a grief-stricken 12-year-old boy contained a lesson he learned too well. Mechanical systems can be perfected through patient study. Every component serves a specific function. Standardization enables efficiency. Control produces predictability. But humans are not pocket watches. Society is not an engine. Workers are not interchangeable components. Some problems cannot be solved through engineering. Some complexity cannot be standardized. Some control costs more than the efficiency it produces. Ford understood machines perfectly but understood people poorly. He could design factories but not families. He could perfect manufacturing but not management. He could see how to make millions of identical automobiles but not how to respect the irreducible individuality of the workers who made them. In the end, the farm didn't consume him, but neither did he fully escape it. He fled physical labor only to impose industrial labor that was often more dehumanizing. He rejected agricultural cycles only to create assembly line rhythms equally relentless. He escaped his father's authority only to become a tyrant more destructive than his father ever was. Yet billions of lives are better because Henry Ford lived. The mobility, the prosperity, the manufacturing capability, the reduction of backbreaking labor, these were genuine achievements that increased human flourishing. His failures don't negate his successes any more than his successes excuse his failures. The story of Henry Ford is the story of industrial civilization itself. It's brilliant and brutal, liberating and oppressive, visionary and blind. We live in the world he helped create, enjoying its benefits while struggling with its costs, still trying to solve the problems his solutions generated. The assembly line continues. The automobiles still roll off production lines, one every few seconds, exactly as Ford envisioned. But the boy who once feared the farm, who once felt the power of a steam engine flowing through his 13-year-old hands, who once saw a future of democratic transportation available to everyone, that boy is gone. What remains is the world he made, still evolving, still creating, still destroying, still trying to escape constraints while creating new ones. The revolution continues. Whether it leads to liberation or catastrophe depends on whether we learn the lessons Ford's life teaches, that every solution creates new problems, that efficiency without humanity becomes cruelty, and that vision without wisdom can transform dreamers into tyrants who cannot distinguish their will from truth itself. The pocket watch keeps ticking, the assembly line keeps moving, and somewhere, always, someone is escaping the farm, chasing a vision of freedom they will never quite achieve, building empires that will both elevate and consume them, proving again that progress is more complicated, more contradictory, and more costly than we ever imagine when we begin.